You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Menna van Praag.
Authors. I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. Before We Ever Spoke by Dan Largent. Cleveland, Ohio, 2006. After a chance encounter, three people soon find out that life can sometimes thrust us into the public eye, even when taking great measures to avoid it. Cooper Madison was the best pitcher in baseball after being drafted number 1 overall in 1996 from the small Gulf Coast town of Pass Christian, Mississippi. 1 year after announcing his sudden and shocking retirement, he finds himself seeking anonymity in Cleveland, Ohio. Kara Knox is the youngest sibling to 3 older brothers. After a tragic work accident to her closest relative, she has built up a tough exterior as she begins her final year of college at Cleveland State University. Jason Knox, Kara's oldest brother, is the lead detective on Cleveland's Edgewater Park killer case. After months without a suspect, he's feeling the heat from his media-hungry chief. Serendipity intervenes, and all three learn that perception and reality are paths that rarely ever intersect. Before We Ever Spoke by Dan Largent. Hey folks, you really ought to check out Patricia Gillam's Heroes of Corvus series. Book 1 is called A Superhero's Duty. A fight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the death of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city are not out of danger. A Superhero's Duty, Book 1 of the Heroes of Corvus by Patricia Gillam. Get this series now. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Menna van Praag on the show with me today. She has an amazing new book. It's called The Sisters Grimm, and I'll tell you what, this is one of the most innovative books that I've read in quite a while, and we'll talk all about it in just a little bit. Welcome to the show, Menna.
Thanks for having me here, Hank.
Well, I'm excited to have you. Menna, you've listened to some shows, so you know that we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I know. I was listening to your shows, and I was racking my brains for the answer. Because everyone comes up with these very thought out questions. And to be quite honest, I have very few memories of my childhood. I always, writers try and ransack their childhoods for great copy, but I find it really difficult because I don't remember much. So if I was to be completely honest, I would have to say that my earliest memory of wanting to be a writer is not until I was doing my A-levels, which is high school, I think. And I was writing some poetry for one of my English literature teachers. And she said, "Oh, these poems are publishable." And it was the first time anyone had ever said to me anything like that before. I always loved stories and I always loved reading, but I don't know that I ever thought I could do that I could be a person, one of these hallowed people who actually creates the stories, until someone told me that I could be.
I love that. Your books, Menna, are really, I love your style where, there are regular people with everyday, problems and situations, but there's a little bit of magic around. And your new book, The Sisters Grimm, takes that to kind of the nth degree. But where do you think that that love of fantasy that sort of permeates the real world, where does that come from? Were you a big fantasy fan as a youngster? Did fairy tales really connect with you? Where do you think this idea of the magic in the everyday comes from?
Okay, that question I can answer, because one of the abiding memories of my childhood is of reading Narnia and becoming obsessed with wardrobes. And my grandmother lived in the north of England in a very spooky house, where there weren't, it was sort of from the 19th century and there were hardly any lights, and we were terrified of it as kids. But she had these enormous wardrobes, like really deep ones made of oak, and I used to obsessively check them. Every time we went to visit, I would just check again to see if Narnia was inside one of those wardrobes. And I remember that very clearly. And I think I never read high fantasy as a child. It was always things that were set in this world but had magic in them. So there was another story I loved called The Water Babies, which was a Victorian tale about a chimney sweep, and he discovered that there was little children living underneath the water. And this intrigued me. I was so intrigued by things that were specifically in this world, but had some element of magic, because I found those things that I could believe that they were true. Whereas high fantasy, I just didn't believe in that. That was the stuff of dreams.
Sure.
Where magic in this world was like, well, maybe. I mean, honestly, I'm sort of a lot older now, in my 40s, and I'm still think that perhaps Narnia is in a wardrobe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am with you 100%. This would, sometimes life can be pretty hard. And if you don't believe that there might be a little magic sprinkled about, that makes it almost unbearable.
Yes, I completely agree.
So, Menna, if I understand your story, your personal story, you were attempting to be a writer, that you kept writing and trying to get something published, and you had not been successful until you were about 30, and you decided to write what became Men, Money, and Chocolate. Is that right?
Yes. So when I decided when I absolutely knew I wanted to be a writer, I was 19 and I read a book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron.
Yes.
And that book absolutely changed my life because I did the steps that before that I had zero belief in myself. I mean, after that I didn't have much belief, but I could connect with something. And I did the morning pages religiously for about 2 years. And then I said to my husband, who I met very young, we were 19, and I said to him, I'm going to give myself until I'm 30 to be a writer. So I was studying at Oxford and he agreed, he said, okay, fine, and we were like, right, we're not going to have kids. We're not going to do anything sensible. We're not going to get a house. You're just going to try and be a writer. Like, I'd give it this decade, because I thought I had a bit of a sad conversation with my dad before I made that decision. And he told me that he'd always wanted to be a writer, but he'd never had the courage. It really marked me. Sometimes you have these conversations and they really mark you. And I thought, I cannot do that. I cannot not try, because I think it's so much sadder to have not tried to do something than it is to try and not succeed. And so I graduated from Oxford and became a waitress. And all my family were horrified because they said, why don't you get a proper job? You have a good degree and everything. And I dedicated all of my time when I wasn't working to writing. I mean, to be honest, I dedicated most of my time when I was working to writing. I would sort of be, waitressing and then scribbling story ideas on my notepad. I didn't pay much attention. And then it was about 4 months before my 30th birthday, and I started freaking out because I was like, oh my God, I made this promise.
I'm out of time.
And seriously, I was such a perfectionist and I was so self-critical throughout my whole 20s that I could never finish anything. I would write 3 chapters and that would be it. And I would start another 3 chapters and I would send them off to agents and I would get rejections and I just couldn't do it. And then that summer, I thought, well, I have to do this, otherwise I'm in trouble. So I took 2 weeks off work and I sat down and wrote a very simple novella, which was 30,000 words. And it was just about my life. It was just about a girl who was a waitress, who longed to be a writer and didn't have the confidence to do it. And in the book, she decides to self-publish, and then she becomes, then she gets a publisher. And I had no intention of self-publishing because this was back, this was like 12 years ago.
And it was before the Kindle revolution and indie publishing really became a legitimate thing.
Absolutely. So it meant doing something completely different, but I did it. I sent the book to the only publisher in England that I thought would publish it, which was called Hay House, because it was a slightly kind of spiritual book and a bit of a memoir. And there was nothing really kind of like it. The only thing like it, I would say, would be The Alchemist. But, you can't go around saying that you've written something like The Alchemist. Publishers will just laugh at you. And I gave it to my mom, who is a life coach, and she's always inspired me my whole life. And she said to me, well, you have to do what the character in the book does. You have to self-publish it. And I said, no way, I'm not doing that. But I realized I had to do that because what else could I do? And in those days, that meant printing physical copies of the book at some expense and taking them to bookstores and begging the people in the bookstores to put them in the window or put them on the table or anything like that. And I did that for 6 months and it terrified me because I'm very reticent and shy generally. And I would bake them cookies and I would take them into the stores. And sometimes I would find a wonderful bookseller. There was a wonderful bookseller called Hannah in Borders in Cambridge. And she sold 50 copies all by herself because she loved the book. And she told everyone to buy it. And there were other horror stories of, going around schlepping from bookstore to bookstore and nobody would take it. But anyway, long story short, 9 months later, I sent it back to Hay House, the same exact book, and they had rejected it before, 9 months before, saying, oh, this is nothing new, we're not interested. 9 months later, I took it to them and I'd sold nearly 1,000 copies by myself. And in those days, that was quite an achievement. And because this was before ebooks, right? So, and they said, and suddenly it was hilarious. Suddenly they said, oh my God, this is so original. We love this. Which always just goes to show that you shouldn't take rejection too badly, because it might not be the book that they're rejecting. It might be for some, other million random reasons that you have no idea. Because once I proved to them that it could be a success, then they jumped on it and they published it. They published it exactly as it was without changing it. And they sold it in 26 different territories. So it's been translated into 26 languages.
That is incredible. What do you think it is, or that it was about that book that connected so deeply with people? Is it because you were finally fearless to tell your own story, even though it's couched in, a little bit of magic and in this fable? But was it just you laying yourself bare and finally giving yourself permission to tell the story that you always wanted to?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It was my most, the book where I most bared my own heart and soul. I just wrote exactly myself on the page. Like whenever my mom reads it, she says, it's just like you're with me. It's so, that book is so me. And to date, of all the other books I've written, I still get the most emails about that book. So I think people can feel someone's heart when they've written something that's very honest.
So after having this success with this book and spending some months really connecting with readers, which is an experience that a lot of authors don't get to have. A lot of times we write a book, we find an agent online, we email with them, we send the book that way. Maybe we make some bookstore appearances, but that's very different than carting a box of books and saying, would you please, believe in my book and recommend it to other people. That's a very unique experience in today's marketplace. After this book, had found its publisher and all of that, how do you decide to follow that experience up?
Well, you're quite right. It was a completely unique experience. I never had that experience since then. And to be honest with you, I never would have coveted that experience because, as I say, I think maybe like all writers, I'm naturally reticent. I chose writing because I wanted to hide behind my words. I didn't choose acting. I didn't choose the thing where you put yourself in front of people. I always thought actors completely mad, because why would you put yourself on a stage and let people see you? And I remember when I did publish that book, I said to Hay House, because they do a lot of events there, I said, I will never do events. I will never do workshops. And they said, okay, fine. Because in those days, you didn't have to have a platform. I think nowadays you really need some kind of platform. And so eventually my publishers dragged me kicking and screaming onto social media. And honestly, now I've embraced it to quite an extent, but I'm still shy.
Yeah. You have, is the Sisters Grimm, is this your fifth book?
It's, no, I think it's my eighth.
The eighth? Oh, excuse me.
No,
Sorry.
no, I lost track. You see, I can't even remember. I wrote 5 magical realism books. Then.
Okay, that's what I'm. That's where I got that number.
That's where you got the 5. Yeah.
Yeah. When you when it came time to start this story, what was the thought process at the beginning of the Sisters Grimm? What was the first kernel of an idea? Because this book is a bit of a departure from the other things that you've done. Not really in the beginning, but the layers of this story are so complex and really pull from another place. How did this book begin for you?
Well, it began a lot simpler than it ended because if I'd have known what it was going to be, I honestly don't think I would have embarked on it. I thought it would be quite a simple story. And generally, I write books fairly quickly, but this book took me near on 5 years. Yeah, it was an epic. It started very simply. It started with the idea of four sisters because I'd given birth to a daughter, and I was thinking a lot about stories, because you read stories to your children and you think about yourself in a different way. And I was thinking about her growing up and the role models I wanted her to have. And I thought about fairy tales because they're such a go-to, story when it comes to children. And I was thinking about the Brothers Grimm, and I thought, that they're not really feminist stories. They're not sort of stories that I would want her to aspire to. And then I started rewriting them just for her, and rewriting the endings and rewriting them with empowerment. And then I started to think that the Brothers Grimm, essentially appropriated those stories from generally women who would tell them orally but wouldn't write them down. And then I thought how he was like the father or the adoptive father of all of these sisters. And that was where the idea for the Sisters Grimm came. And then it took on a lot of twists and turns. And by sort of midway through, when there was there was several perspectives, and then there was time jumps, and sometimes I was weeping over my computer because I couldn't believe that I gave myself such a task, and then there was another world in it, and there were a few times where I was close to giving up, but I knew there was something there that I didn't want to let go of.
So let's look at some of the characters. First off, there's this kind of overarching story of this fairy tale setup. We've got a demon who is set on world domination and has an army of daughters to help him corrupt humanity. But that's not how the book opens. We open and we're kind of a day in the life of Goldie, one of our four main characters. We've got Goldie, Liyana, Scarlet, and Bee. But we're living through Goldie in the beginning. Was she the first character that came to you, the first that allowed you inside her head?
Yeah, very much so. And I've always found Goldilocks to be an enigmatic character because we don't really know much about her. She goes into this house of bears and she sleeps in their beds and she eats their porridge. But why does she do it?
Right.
Is she just naughty? And so she intrigued me, and I thought there was a lot of leeway for expanding her as a character. And I thought, well, if I put her in this world, what would she be doing? And I thought, well, she'll be working in a hotel and she'll be stealing things from the patrons there, because it suddenly made sense. You've got all those beds that you can sleep in. You've got all all that porridge that you can eat. So essentially I had her be a chambermaid, and I found that really intriguing. And then I discovered that she had a younger brother called Teddy, again, a reference to the bears, and that she was essentially stealing to look after him. And I'm not a plotter. I'm not someone who ever plans a book, because I think if I did, sometimes it would scare me. It would be too much. I just go in, and I see who is in the story, and I see if it intrigues me. And I give it about 5 chapters. And if I feel that I have something, then I keep going. And that's how I write.
And we're seeing, when the book opens, we're seeing Goldie in a modern day setting. What is it about this idea of And we touched on it a little bit earlier about kind of the magic that's all around us, but there's also this theme of people sort of waking up to who they really are. Was that a theme you were thinking about?
Yes, I mean, that's a theme in all my books, whether it's magical or non-magical. I think magic is a great metaphor for that. You know, you always have like the chosen one. You have someone who is special, but they don't necessarily know it. And I think for me, that's a marvelous metaphor for all of us. That generally, unless we're super self-confident, which I don't know anyone who is that confident when they're younger, or even when they're older, that they, you know, we need to discover ourselves, and we need people to support us, and we need to be told, like I needed to be told by my teacher that I could publish, that there was something there. And now I teach students, and I'm exactly the same. All my students have zero self-confidence pretty much going in, and they don't believe that they're capable, but they have a little something, you know, they have a little desire, they have a little hope, and they just need someone to inspire them. And I feel that we all do that. We all need that. And so all of my characters are riddled with self-doubt, and you know, they don't know where they're going in their lives, and they don't know who they are. And in this story, I found that using that magic and using that fantasy world for them to discover their empowerment and their self-realization to be a very powerful metaphor. And I really enjoyed playing with that. But essentially, it's the same as all the other books, but it's just a lot more fantastical.
Right. Well, one thing that I noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your previous books have been very much grounded in our present world with sort of some magic leaking in, if you will. And in this book, their reality is the fantasy world, and they're kind of waking up to that. Is that a difference for you? Was that something conscious that we're dealing with two worlds and people that are sort of asleep here and waking up to what the real world really is?
To be totally honest, no. You put that very well, and that is the first time. I mean, I guess unconsciously, but I didn't realize that consciously. That's a really, really well put. That yes, they're asleep in this world, and it's the other world that is the real world. And I suppose again, yeah, it's just an inversion of it, but it's wherever we are asleep in our lives, whether it's we're not realizing who we are, we're not realizing our own powers, or just the sadness, like you said at the beginning, about what kind of a world would it be if there was no magic in it, you know?
Yeah, if the mundane was all there is, then yeah. There's some really strong themes in this book. You know, the ones we've talked about already, but there's also the the theme of sisterhood, and what we can do together is so much bigger than what we can do apart, and just the rooting for one another, and the way we empower each other. It's a strong theme in this book. But also this theme of nature versus nurture, almost. We've got people that are daughters of a demon, and does that mean that they are destined to corrupt the world around them and dominate, or are we capable of more than we were born into? Could you talk a little bit about those things? I know you were writing this with a new daughter, and as a parent myself, things come alive in you when you have a child that you never thought you were capable of. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you were going through in the genesis of this book?
Yeah, definitely. I felt also, because I also had a son before my daughter, but I felt differently with my daughter. I think there was something about being a mother, seeing yourself so much in your daughter, and it made me worry in a different way than I had with my son. There was like a whole new set of problems, potential problems. And so, yeah, this book became a lot more about parenthood than I anticipated. And it's only really kind of looking back on it now that I see how much, because there's so much about motherhood, about how much our upbringing influences us, how much choice do we have, how we should feel about ourselves given, how we react to our circumstances. And that, again, there was that metaphor between in terms of the light and the dark, because I've always believed that we all have good and bad in us. We all have the potential for goodness and not. And it's about the choices we make in our daily lives. And it's also about how we're brought up in this world. So I wanted to explore all of those different dynamics in terms of how we're shaped and how much we can shape ourselves.
Right. This book, like we talked about, deals with so many heavy themes, but it is so much fun. It reads like, I can tell that you are influenced by Narnia because there's that sense of wonder and excitement, and there's a little bit of subterfuge, and there's just so much fun stuff going on in this book. One thing that I really like is the alternating narrative style that you chose. We open the book and it's first person in Goldie's perspective, but then we get to sort of head hop with some other characters in the third person. How did you choose, your viewpoints that you're writing from, and at what point in the book did you realize that you were going to do it that way?
Well, initially, I wanted to write them all in the first person. And I tried it, and it was so difficult because I just found it really, really hard to get myself into each of their heads and out of them again, and to make the writing style so unique to each of them. Because I really feel that if you're writing in the first person, you ought to be able to tell who is talking without being told who's talking. So I wanted their voices to be very unique. And it was just too much of a mind thing. I just couldn't figure it out. And with all of the different perspectives and going back in time and going forward in time, and then having also the second person when we go into Everwhere, it just was like, no. So I kept Goldie as the protagonist in the first person because I love writing in the first person. I think that was the first time I ever did that. And I found it very immediate. And then it became easier to look at the other perspectives. Also, because if you write in the first person, you can't refer to things that person doesn't know about. So that became interesting because you've got the soldier, Leo, and Goldie doesn't know what's going on with him. So that became interesting to write from her perspective because there was so much she didn't know. Whereas with some of the other characters, they knew a lot more about what was going on. So writing in the third person was easier. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I know that this book is the first in a series. Is that right?
Yeah.
Did you know this was going to be a series when you began it?
No. As I said before, if I'd have known how big this was going to be, I wouldn't have started it, because it was absolutely a standalone. And I wrote it and I finished it. And I do feel it has a proper ending because that's the ending that it had when I gave it when I wrote it. It has a proper ending. And I sent it to my agent and he said, well, could this be a trilogy? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe. And so he said, well, see what you think. And so I thought about it and I was like, well, actually, I love these characters and I'm not ready to leave them yet. And so I wrote 2 synopses for books 2 and 3. And then when he submitted it to publishers, he sent it out like that. And then people wanted it. So that was great. But it wasn't a game plan. It was more, again, the way I write the books, it was more just happened.
Well, it's one of life's happy accidents, and we're all grateful for it. The Sisters Grimm is out, available everywhere now. I love this book, Menna, and I'm sharing it with my daughters, who are all grown but love a great story, and it's been a great thing to bond over with them, and so I just wanted to tell you that. If people are just learning about you and want to connect with all the great stuff that you do, is there a place where they can find you online?
Yeah, I'm mainly on Instagram, which is just menna.van_praag. I'm sometimes on Twitter and Facebook, but I find it hard to keep up with all of them. So what I like about Instagram is they have books, and I love books so much. So I'm always chattering about the books that I'm reading and that I'm loving, and posting pictures on there.
Fantastic. Menna, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy of the Sisters Grimm, and to find you online. We'll put links to all your great stuff there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hank.